welcome to episode 2 of the Housing Anarchy podcast. Now, one of the reasons I started this podcast is because I wanted to look at alternative housing more so than focus on van life, which is more what my Donna Van Life channel was about. That being said, this particular podcast is about van life, but it's about van life for housing and how in some ways that is different than van life for like camping or travel or anything like that, because I do think they do come with different needs, and also the way you go into it, if you are doing it for affordable housing, should be different than how you're going into it if you're going into it for camping and travel. Now, I realize there are some exceptions. There are people who live in more rural areas who may have more active access to things like BLM land, but some people don't, and they don't want to leave their job. They just want to reduce their expenses. So this is really a chance to talk about and explore that. Now, before I start, I do want to say this isn't about saying one is better than the other. It's just different. And I don't think you need to think of one as better or lesser or more or the right reason to do van life or the wrong reason to do van life. Your reason for doing van life, as long as it's good for you, is a good reason. Also, you can have a need for something such as affordable housing, but still have goals to move towards camping and travel. Plenty of people have done it. They've started out with a van life goal that was simply about the fact that their housing was too expensive. They stayed in their city, they've kept their job, and they've used their extra money to improve their van life to a point that they were able to break off into an adventure traveling lifestyle. They've just done it a little slower instead of instantly. You could also be a part-time camper who wants to transition to full-time, and in doing that, your needs in van life may change and align more with those who do it for housing purposes as opposed to just camping and traveling purposes. Depending on what you do for work, your needs for housing in van life may be completely different. Like working seasonally with housing has different needs than working from remote locations with limited signal, but your work requires you to go out to those remote locations. And it has different needs than working a 9-to-5 job. What I find is too many people want the all answers vehicle without asking themselves very serious and real questions about what they need for their personal lifestyle and what's a priority for them. Like, I've spent a lot of my van life working in the Bay Area, California. The fact is, in the Bay Area, California, Northern California, the northern being important, it's a very special set of circumstances when it comes to weather. We have very neutral weather. If you go out to Tahoe, it's going to be pretty snowy. If you go down to LA, it's going to be hotter. But the Bay Area is pretty neutral. It gets a little bit colder, it gets a little bit hotter, but there aren't a lot of extreme temperature changes that I've had to navigate by spending most of my van life here while I was working. And I've said all this to point out that van life for housing is situationally specific. So some of the things I say may feel irrelevant to you if you live in Minnesota. But at the same time, I do think there are some important ways that van life for housing has very different needs to it that are specific to it that are going to be universal no matter where you are attempting to do van life for housing as opposed to van life for camping and travel. I feel like a lot of people who do van life for housing do fall into the category of falling under financial limitations and job obligations. Now, they want the benefit of not paying rent. That's basically what it usually comes down to. You're usually renters, you're usually not a homeowner, and you are sick of paying rent. And you usually need to pay rent on top of owning a vehicle in order to be able to navigate the world in some way. And so the idea of combining these expenses into one thing is sort of your primary motivation for being in van life for housing. Now, you can get in that situation by force, i.e. you can't pay rent, all you have is a car, and you move into it, or a van, or some other vehicle. Or you can get into it by choice, where you can see the possibility of there not being enough money some month, and therefore you make a choice to start to transition and downsize your life so that you can fit it into a vehicle dwelling lifestyle of some sort. You're not concerned in this situation about traveling, about getting out of your town, about like going away and seeing the world. You do see that as a benefit you can maybe attain at some point, but that is not while you're doing it. It's because the housing in some way is starting to become an untenable situation. And like I said, you can get there forced into it, but you can also simply see the forest through the trees, not want it to get that bad, and start wanting to plan to transition your life out of traditional housing and into some form of non-traditional housing. And when you're in that mindset, you see camping and travel as something maybe you can do with your rig sometimes when you have the money and the free time, but you are mostly accepting the idea of being locked into the same area. And that's fine with you, because all you want to do is lower your expenses. Now, the general rule, if you are renting, is rent should not be more than 30% of your income. Now, for people who are either forced or by choice to go into van life, probably your rent, and that's before other things you might have to pay, like utilities, your car insurance, all these other things. Maybe you even have a car payment. It's probably just the rent is probably taking more than 30% of your income. And then after you pay all your additional bills and you eat and survive and live, there's nothing left. And so you might get frustrated with that. And in that situation, van life might feel like an answer, because now you can combine, again, the expenses of having a vehicle with the expenses of having a roof over your head. And the good thing about being in the position to plan it, of not being forced out and only having that car, but being able to plan it, is you can put things in place to make, hopefully, your life a little bit more comfortable in that transition. But it really depends on how much time you have. If you know, like, your lease is ending in like a month, you have that month. So you have whatever money you can get in that month. So still, you may not want to go out and get the biggest, most expensive, fanciest rig you can get. That would take all of your money. You wouldn't have anything to back up and fall back on. And maybe you don't have enough for a good emergency fund. And maybe that's fine, because you are not planning to travel. You are just trying to get these expenses under control. So you may be at an equal position when you start to somebody who's been forced into it, because you both just had to go out, get a cooler, get something you can turn into a bed real quick, get some plastic, furniture to start out, because of the financial situation you're going into van life with. Now, if you're lucky enough to still have a job, income, some type of employment in your local area, you know that you have more money coming in as long as you don't travel. And some people would hate this. These people are not a good fit for this type of choice when it is a choice, because they consider it a limitation. They can't travel, instead of seeing the advantage of having the cheaper lifestyle plus still the secure income. And that's a very different mentality when it comes to entering van life. You have to know what it means to be doing this for housing as a first priority, not a second, not a third, not a 25th, but as a first priority is the cheaper housing. If you're going into that with that perspective, the worst thing you can do is go and get the biggest, fanciest, most pimped out vehicle you can, if that is not financially in the window of the time that you need to transition out of traditional housing into this non-traditional housing choice. But being able to choose, knowing you have, 3 months before the end of your lease and you'll be able to control the situation till then, is a very powerful position to be in. Because you can do so much pre-planning that the person who finds themselves with housing one day and without housing the next day cannot do. So if anybody is thinking about doing this as a choice, I urge you to really, really, really run some deep numbers, look deeply at it, and really think about sort of what your goals and priorities are. And if you are in it by force, like one day everything's good, faster than you can realize it, now everything's not good, maybe something happened, maybe you were in a bad relationship and unfortunately you weren't the highest wage earner, or you weren't on the lease, or something happened where you instantly had to go, or very quickly had to go from traditional housing to a non-traditional situation, like living in a car. it doesn't mean you can't build up. Whatever you start in, you can build up in it. And so you have to find a way to embrace a very slow build up, because you can't afford for it to be anything else. I personally had to build up from the unexpected situation of having to live in my car. I could not prepare or buy things ahead of time. I honestly didn't know how. I wasn't planning long-term existence in the car. It was a stopgap for me to have a roof over my head and be safe at night when I had to sleep. I was 100% moving back towards traditional housing at first, before I started to do more research on van life and start to try to figure out how to do it. And I was not in the convenient position of, being able to be an effective planner. I hated sleeping in the front seat of my car. And there were people on Vanlife forums and stuff like that that were trying to convince me to alter the car. I had no plans to alter that car, because eventually I wanted to get rid of it as a car and get a van. When my goals changed, it was from, I'm going to embrace this and I'm going to try to move into a van, which will give me more comforts. And the first van I got was a Toyota Sienna minivan that I lived in for the better part of 2 years. And I did have a payment plan on that van, which I could handle with the amount of income I was able to generate. And I had to handle insurance on that van, and obviously I had to put gas in that van. But all those things were attainable things at that point. The only way I got my van was at a your job's your credit place, which is why I had a payment plan on the van the entire time I lived in it. But that payment plan was cheaper than rent. Also, I did not have a driveway or anywhere I could do a build. So the first night I got my minivan, all I did was move the stuff in boxes. It was all neatly packed up from the car to the minivan. It was all sitting in the back of the minivan. And then I slept in the minivan by just putting down the seat, just like I had done in the car. The next day I went to a parking lot. I pulled out the seats. I had to get the seats towed away. I could not store them. I'd already given up on this minivan, unlike the car, ever going back to the state of being a minivan. So I got the seats out, got them towed away. I paid a guy like $50 to take them away. And I bought a camping cot. And I bought some bins from Target, and that was how I did my first build in a day. It was just stuff I arranged in there really quick into a living space so I could unpack and be in there kind of comfortably. And then slowly but surely, I built up over time. Now, there was some stuff I could not do while living in the vehicle, and that's because, like, whenever you do build outs as you live in them, as much as people talk about it, it is difficult because you don't have a garage to throw things in so they're out of your way. So you have to find a way to shove it in your living space while you're not using it, because there's nothing else you can do. There's nowhere to put this thing that you can't install yet because you don't have all the parts, or you don't have the time, or you don't have the location to install it. So I had to be very pragmatic about what I was buying. So even when I had the money, it was like, is there a point in buying this thing and having to live around it without being able to use it until I can get the next thing or the other things I need? And so those were constant choices. And then I also, thankfully, one of the side jobs I had was pet sitting, which gave me access to houses every once in a while. And I would use that time when I was not directly living in the vehicle to do projects that could take multiple days. Recently, while I was working at Oregon Shakespeare Festival, I had employee housing, and I needed to redo my electrical system. Well, luckily, because I had the employee housing, I moved myself out, I moved my cats out, and then I was able to do that project because it took several days. I had to pull a lot of things out of the way. I literally had to make it a little bit unlivable in here to get it done and then clean up afterwards. But I need those days of not living in here directly in order to complete that work. And even when I was in the minivan, there were certain projects where I held off because I was waiting for an opportunity where I could buy things, I could execute the project, and I wouldn't have to live in the space while I'm doing it. Because whenever I did a project, I had to know I had to find a place to do it. I had to maybe pull things apart and pull things out the way, and then have it all back together again before I had to go to sleep that night. And that was a time crunch sometimes, and it was very, very challenging. And so, going back to the whole financial aspect of why a lot of people, not everyone, but why a lot of people get into van life for housing are financial limitations. And those financial limitations mean sometimes you actually end up taking on debt along the way. I was paying down some credit cards. There were times, in order to have what I needed, I had to take a hit on those credit cards in the middle of trying to pay them down in order to survive, another month or the month after that. And I will even say I didn't get the best deal on my van. I don't regret it. It was the choice I had to make at the time to be comfortable, to survive. And I would have preferred paying that car note for the 2 years over keeping the car and being uncomfortable for 2 years. Because I got to be comfortable for 2 years. I had a place that actually had a bed in it, and I was able to pay the car note, unlike rent, which I had not been able to pay previously. And so there was advantage in that. The car note was less. Was it the best deal ever on that Toyota Sienna? Absolutely not. I overpaid for it, and I will always say I did. But it was a decent van. It gave me very little trouble, and I have no regrets in how it bridged me to where I am now. And this brings me to a piece of advice I occasionally find annoying, and that's when people are like, oh, you can just get it and build up as you go. And this is true. You can start simple and build up as you go, but a lot of people who give that advice haven't actually experienced what it's like to build as you go and what that actually means. Like, I've had people advise me to do things to my van that I know are much more complicated than they seem to think it is. Like, I was advised that hard-sided panels are better for solar than the flexible panels I'm using. Is this true? Yes, all of the evidence says hard-sided panels are better. Are they better enough that I need to spend the expense of a rigging system that I don't currently have on my box truck in order to install hard-sided panels? And the simple answer is no. I do have flexible panels on my roof. They are light enough that I can carry them to my roof. I can attach them without expensive rigging hardware, and so far it's working just fine. For what I could afford, for the amount of time the project would take, for how many other people I would have had to involve besides myself to do it, the flexible panels were the better choice for the type of situation in which I was installing solar. And it's working just fine. So, yes, the hard-sided panels, without a doubt, are better than the flexible panels if you believe the experts. Now, I'm just going to give it to them because I'm not the person who can test in that situation. But has not making that choice made my life any harder? No. Flexible panels are fine. My battery system is fine. And I am not in any shortage for not having made the hard panel choice. However, hard panels, heavy, can't carry them to the roof myself. Rigging system, definitely couldn't have come up with one myself that works for my box truck, and so I would have had to employ or pay for somebody else to do it, and that would have gotten very, very expensive when the way I did it was affordable enough for me and works. Now, I would say this particular roadblock isn't just relevant to people who are doing van life for housing. It's relevant to anybody who's doing van life full-time without a home, land, or some place that they own. They just have the vehicle. And some people who go into van life for travel do face this problem of needing to do some sort of project, not having a location to do it, and either having to reach out to family or friends in order to find a spot to do it. But sometimes there's an immediate problem, i.e., I had a solar cable get ripped by a tree and I needed to get on my roof and fix it, which I did. But the biggest hurdle in that was not doing the actual repair. Now that I know enough about repairing MC4 connectors, it was actually really easy. But the biggest hurdle was actually finding a place where I could park and climb up on my roof. Especially since I was just driving through city areas at the time where I saw this cable swinging out of the side view mirror. And the hardest part was just finding a location to stop, pull out my ladder, do that repair real quick. So anybody who's full-time, who runs into problems like this, is going to face the hurdle of, I need to do an upgrade project, a change, something that requires space, time, and pulling out tools. Where can I do it? So, and a lot of what I'm about to talk about, it is more relevant to people who do van life in the quote-unquote city. Now, mind you, every city is not San Francisco or New York, which are huge, busy cities, or yes, it is very difficult to park large vehicles. There are a lot of cities in the United States of America that very much fall under the umbrella of cities that are smaller, that are slower paced, that have, more open streets than closed ones that you could use. There's all kinds of size of city across the United States. And people tend to black and white city and rural. In a way that's kind of unfair, because there's such a huge range, and I personally do not like busy cities, but I do like being near city-fied areas when it comes to being near resources when I'm being very static. I do like to go out camping, but that has honestly been like the smallest part of my van life experience in almost 4 years. And I only like to go out when I know I have the money and time to do so, without feeling like the going out, quote unquote, is going to be a burden. At the end of the day, I know what vehicle I chose. I have a box truck that gets 10 miles to the gallon. So I either like to be in an area where I can get to everything I want in short spurts of driving, or to be able to go out and settle down somewhere for 2 weeks at a time. Like, I want that full 2-week stretch if I'm going to go out camping. And if I can't, and I need to be in the city where I'm probably going to move, at least for my daytime and nighttime spots, if not to jobs, I want to be close to things. I want to be able to get to a laundromat, a grocery store, propane, and a water fill within 10 to 15 minute drives from wherever I usually hang out during the day or sleep at night. And I've been able to pull this off. And some people think it's crazy to do van life in these areas, but they're forgetting these areas have jobs. Assuming you don't already have that online job, or you don't have the social media presence to do like YouTube full time yet, staying near the job you already have that will pay your bills is just smart. Some of the biggest hurdle to van life and RV living for travel is bringing in income. You need money to live in a vehicle, rather you are mostly static or very travel heavy. If your vehicle is paid off, you will still need insurance, gas, and to pay for maintenance and upkeep at the most basic level. Now, people with a travel goal usually want to find a way to make money for traveling, and this includes building a YouTube channel about their travels. The problem is some of this stuff is a slow burn, and let's be honest, at this moment, the whole van life on YouTube thing is oversaturated. Depending on what your background is, your skills, ambitions are, you may find some other way to profit from travel so that it funds your ability to live RV or van life on the road more actively. Or you may be able to find a online job that you can work on the road, or you may be able to transfer your current job into something that you can use as a nomad. But if you can't do all these things, the easiest thing for you to do is just get a regular old job while living in your van or whatever you're living in. Now, there is also seasonal work, which is something some people do, where they go somewhere, they work for a specific amount of time, they get some money, they bank that money so that it supports traveling openly for a certain amount of time. Then they get another seasonal job, bank some more money, and travel some more. Lots of people live their lifestyle this way, and this could be something where it's career specific, like me, where I do theater work, or it could be something less career specific, where like maybe you work at resorts during a certain season, or maybe you work as a camp host, or maybe you do the beet harvest, or maybe you do the Amazon seasonal. They have a seasonal thing they do that is for RVers, where they will give you a spot. I think it's usually around the holidays. I forgot what it's called. I've talked about it in other videos. And a lot of people like this because they get a spot in a job for a certain amount of time, and then they have 3 months of travel where they're not working, and then they do it again, and they cycle that either multiple times a year or maybe once a year, depending on like what their life and lifestyle is like. These people are mixing sort of this whole van life for travel thing with being obligated to a static job for a certain amount of time. But if you are just keeping your location based job in a city, probably you are going to want a vehicle that blends in with city vehicles. If you are doing van life for travel, this is honestly not as important as people make it out to be. You can get away with a lot of things for one night. So if you are just traveling across the USA and you need to pull off the road for a little bit, and you find a legal parking spot and you pull in it for one night, you'll probably get away with it as long as you are legally parked. The problem comes in when you decide to stay in that spot multiple nights in a neighborhood where you don't belong, in a vehicle that is quote unquote obvious. You can have an obvious vehicle and do anything for one night, as long as you don't try to live there, as long as you don't try to move in, because you can have the stealthiest vehicle in the world, and when you try to do it for more than one night, when you try to move in, you are increasing your chances of getting a knock and being asked to leave, because you're trying to overtake advantage and not just park once. So you can have a very obvious vehicle and park once in most places. Look at what I have. It is not the stealthiest of stealth. It's also not the most obvious of obvious. People are very confused when they see this. Some people immediately know what it is, and other people are like, are you hauling stuff? Like, what do you have in there? Like, you know, I've gotten all kinds of questions. I had a guy ask me how I like, you know, my job driving the box truck, because he was about to start driving one and he was nervous about it. So my box truck falls in a very weird space, but it is a city work vehicle, which means if people aren't thinking too hard about it, they just see a box truck and their eye keeps going. As long as it's somewhere they expect to see it. If I park at a Home Depot that also has a Target and I don't know, a grocery store, and it's parked like near enough to the Home Depot, people aren't thinking too much. Oh, that makes sense. Why? It's a box truck. It's sitting at the Home Depot. There's probably other box trucks there. So yeah, like, you can take advantage of any sort of vehicle that has a life in the city. Like delivery vehicles, plumbers vehicles, mechanics vehicles. They are all the same type of large sort of vans and trucks that van lifers use. And so when you're in the city, being able to be mistaken, you don't have to over advertise it. You don't have to put plumber on the side of the, I mean, you can do the extra steps that you want. I have a little magnet that says seasonal worker, and that's because I was constantly parking in the same neighborhood while I was at OSF, and I wasn't even living in the truck. So I wanted people to make a brain association. If I was parking for one night, I wouldn't have bothered. But you can go the extra step of putting some sort of label on the outside of your vehicle, but you don't have to. There are, independent construction workers, plumbers, roofing guys, painters that all own the same vehicles that we do as van lifers. And some of them aren't marked because they're just like that guy who gets, like, Bob is like, hey, Sam does a good job and recommends him to his neighbor. And he's never really had to advertise on the side of the van that he bought to carry his paint supplies. And so as long as your van is there for one night, you could be some guy's painter, some guy's plumber, some guy's this, that, or the other thing. You could be the delivery guy. Because people aren't looking as hard at your vehicle as you think they are, as long as it's kind of blending in. So for people who do city static style van life, blending in with those vehicles, being around just long enough for people not to think too hard about it, is a much larger priority. If you are mostly using your vehicle for camping and you only do one-off parks in the city, it's not really as important for you to blend in with these city vehicles. You can be as obvious on the outside of your vehicle as you want. But for the long-term peace of yourself as a city van lifer doing this for housing while keeping your job, it is much more important to blend in a little bit. Now, I personally think stealth is more behavior than the vehicle. Still believe this. Because I've had plenty of people with plain white vans tell me how often they get the knock. And it's mostly because they refuse to vary their parking habits enough that this isn't happening. Mostly. Whereas I have this thing, this giant box van, and like, my knocking situation has not increased at all. And there's been exactly one incident that I recall right now in the actual box van. And it was because I took a chance on a shopping center, and it turned out security came up and was like, you can't, no, I'm lying, it happened twice. It was at a Target and a JCPenney, where I took a chance. That's the only place I've never gotten a knock on the street. I've never been actually disturbed on the street in the box van. And I've slept in a lot of shopping centers where I was completely ignored. And that's because my parking behavior you're never going to see me here all the time. You see me enough that you're like, oh, that truck shows up every once in a while, if you're even paying that much of attention. And it's around enough areas where you're going to see other trucks and utility vehicles that it's not jumping out at you. So yeah, that blending in is much more important when you're trying to pull off city life than it is when you're out camping. And that's why the RV is usually the most undesirable vehicle for city van lifers, because it looks like an RV. Even if it's a Winnebago that was like built on like a chassis of a standard van, if anything on the outside really pops out as RV, that could be less appealing than just getting your own van and being able to decide how much of your RV-ness you want to expose. Because Winnebago isn't building their vans for city stealth. They're not building their Class V vans to blend in. They're building them to look like fancy machines. Whereas when you're a city van lifer, the appeal of like looking like an RV as little as possible. Now, I don't think that means you should skip solar or roof vents or anything like that, but that could be its own video. I think you can do those things, and people will still mostly ignore them because people who are not in van life aren't paying that much attention to you. And the people who do know about van life think it's cool. So, I don't think personally that's as big of a problem as people make it out to be. But still, in areas especially where they may have had problematic van lifers, you want to give them a reason to not look your way too hard. So that covers outside appearance, and that's one of the reasons you actually may like a lower roof van, because lower roof vans cause less attention than higher roof vans. That's why you might want a van instead of an RV, because you want to blend in with that city look. But the thing is, how much do you want to give up the comforts of being inside? Like, I lived in a minivan for around 2 years. I personally was comfortable for the most part. There was a big issue of comfort on the inside, and that's obviously not being able to stand up. And people have different ratings of how important this standing up thing is. One of the most ridiculous things I hear, though, is like, I'm too old to be crawling around. A van is not a low roof apartment. Where are you crawling to? There's no floor space. There's literally no crawling around because there's no floor space to crawl around in. When I had my minivan, I got in the van, I sat on the bed, and I did everything from the bed. And even when I got my Chevy van, which was a little bit bigger, it was a full-size van because it was a Chevy Express, so it was more standard size, cargo van size, I still did almost everything sitting on the bed. There was no place to crawl around to. There was every once in a while I had to get on my knees to maybe perform some tasks or to pull something out from somewhere, but the end goal was always to end up back on the bed, sitting, and then you manipulated everything from the bed, which you'll find with most vans because standardly speaking, there's no floor space to do anything else. And even when you get the big vans, like by the time you put cabinets on both sides, which most people do, there's one little tiny aisle there. There isn't a bunch of floor space in a van the way it is even in a small apartment. So this myth of like crawling around is mostly myth. So when it comes to like standing up as an important feature of living in a van full-time for housing specifically, not for travel. For travel, I think it should be a non-issue. Like if you're doing this for travel and camping, ideally you're spending a heck of a lot of time outside. You're getting to your campsite. You're going to set up a lot of outside elements outside of your metal tent. It's specifically a sleeping structure with a couple of extra bonuses here and there. Maybe you can do a little bit of cooking inside, but, you know, in your preferred situation, you're cooking outside. You know, that's why so many of the mini, tiny vans have pull-out things that you can do outside, because ideally, it's mostly a place to sleep. It's a shelter to go to, and it's something to travel in. When it comes to city van life, obviously you're not going to be spending a ton of time at camping locations. But ideally, also, you have reasons for being in the city, like a job that's getting you out of your vehicle. I remember when I did delivery in my minivan, it was some of my most miserable days in the minivan because I was not getting out of it. Whereas when I had a theater job that I was doing, again, this is all contractual work, so they don't last forever. There's a contractual period that I did any of my work. Then it was great because I drove to a location. I got out of the vehicle. I was out of the vehicle all day. And then at the end of the day, I came back and I was just going to bed. So not being able to stand up and walk around in this imaginary space that didn't exist wasn't actually a big deal. It was only when I started doing more work that kept me in the minivan all day that it became a big deal. Even a bad weather day wasn't a big deal. Whoop-de-doo, I just had to curl up on my bed and like watch some streaming on my phone or read a book or something. That was not a big deal. The on and off bad weather day was not a big deal, especially since I was working enough that even on some of those bad weather days, which was mostly like maybe some terrible rain or something, I was still like likely going to end up out of the vehicle going somewhere for work and then only coming back at night to sleep. So it was not a big deal at all to not stand up. And sometimes you have to actively create the reason to get out of your van. Now that might be going to a local park or a marina or somewhere that's public and open where you can just go hang out. Maybe you can open your doors and, you know, sit out a little bit more exposed instead of being on the side of the road. But that's sort of an active choice that you have to make to engage more with the outside world. Because quite frankly, yeah, I sat up on my bed. I had a little wiggle situation to like get my clothes on. Maybe I made breakfast inside because I would wake up early and usually the sun wouldn't be out yet. And I was not going to go out walking in the dark. But then I could go to a marina or a park or something, open the side door, and immediately as I stepped out of bed, I was standing up. I just wasn't indoors when I was doing it. But if you want that, van life's not for you anyway. Like, if it's so important that you avoid going outside to stand up, maybe van life isn't for you. That being said, now that I do a lot of editing and work inside the box truck, even with my additional seasonal jobs, it is nice to be able to finish, stand up, and stretch a little bit. I also exercise inside the box truck when it's not desirable to go outside to do it. And right now I don't have access to my gym that I fell in love with when I was in Oregon. I can't wait to get back there because I did not get as far in my journey as I wanted to. But that's neither here nor there. The thing is, you can find ways to get out of the vehicle. If you do have to have a low roof vehicle to survive and get by in, if that's all you have plenty of opportunities to stand up. As soon as you get out of bed, go outside. Go somewhere. Can't go outside because the weather is undesirable, go to a mall. Or walk around. Go to the library. You can hang out at most libraries all day. You'll be able to stand up the whole time. And so it was not as big of a deal as people like to make it, not being able to stand up. I will say, if you do get that standing height vehicle, it is harder to go back or imagine going back. I could only see myself doing the minivan again if it was a secondary vehicle for camping trips. That being said, the 2 years that I did it, I was fine. I was without complaints. Now, if you are determined to get a standing height vehicle, there are some that are better for city van life than others. One of my favorites, even though I personally don't have one, is your standard shuttle bus. And we're talking about, there's little shuttle buses that, will pick you up at a college to take you around campus, or the ones that'll come back and forth to nursing homes. And these plain white shuttle buses, and I've seen several, get ignored. And you can have a little bit of solar on the top. You can have an air conditioner on the roof, or a roof vent. And trust me, people will not pay attention as long as there's generally the look of a shuttle bus on the outside. These are great choices. The box truck is also a good choice. Now, I personally have chosen to put 3 windows in mine. And when I installed the windows, everybody was like, that's going to ruin your stuff. That's going to ruin yourself, especially the big one I installed, which is the one right beside me right now. People are like, oh, that's going to ruin your stuff. It hasn't. Hasn't at all. I think my box truck will get the same amount of responses with or without those windows, and I'd rather have the windows. Because, again, people just see a box truck. I've even had people say, oh, that's cool that you found one with windows, which I did not. I installed those windows. I had blood, sweat, and tears installing those windows. Give me my props. But as long as you don't go crazy, people tend to just overlook the box truck. And then, of course, there's your standard standing height van choices, which would be the Sprinter, which is probably the worst choice. And this isn't something against Sprinters. They're expensive. There's a lot of reasons to be against Sprinters. But honestly, at this point, everybody suspects a Sprinter. And the problem with the Ford Transit and the, what's the other one? The ProMaster, is most people don't even know the difference between a Transit, a ProMaster, and a Sprinter on site, who don't really follow the vehicles like that, but they may have seen standing height white vans that were made into rigs. And so what you have on the outside of those vehicles is going to jump out way more than a shuttle bus or a plain white box truck. Because people now have been set the expectation, even casual observers of van life, that might be a camper. However, there are construction people, plumbers, electricians with those vans. I will say, I think actually putting windows on the outside of those vans is more obvious than putting them on the box truck. And I stand by that. Now, there are other disadvantages to a standing height vehicle when it comes to city van life specifically. One, city van life isn't built for regular people to have these vans. So, if you have a minivan or one of the small vans, you can get all of your standard mechanic works done the same way you would if you weren't living in your vehicle. You're going to fit in the quick oil change places. You're going to fit in everybody's bays. As soon as you get tall, you may get rejected from mechanics. I get rejected from mechanics all the time. Sometimes just because they're unwilling to work on it in the parking lot. So if it doesn't fit in the bay, they won't accept it. And then if you go to a commercial place, they charge more because they are used to dealing with people who have fleets of vehicles as opposed to a single vehicle. So you showing up with your one little box truck, they're not going to reduce their prices for that. Too bad for you. And then some RV places are very good with small trucks, and some RV places are not. They only work on RVs that are factory RVs. You have obviously the option of going to the dealership, which I did have to do one time, and it wasn't as nightmare of an experience as, people painted it as, and they fixed the problem, so that was good. But your mechanic situation is going to get very iffy once your vehicle gets tall. You also won't be able to use parking garages, which if you live in a vehicle in a city that especially gets snow, and ice, that might be advantageous if you can pay for a few nights in a parking garage, which might be cheaper than a hotel. You'll be in an enclosed building that'll have a little more temperature control, and you won't have to be trapped outside in the snow. And so that could be advantageous. So to lose the chance to go into a parking garage because you were too tall or too wide might be a negative thing. If you have a smaller vehicle, you just blend in with city vehicles way easier. A mini cargo van, not a low roof full size van, but a mini cargo van is almost indistinguishable from a minivan for most people. So when you're parking and driving around the city, you'll just fit in effortlessly. You won't have to think about it. You won't be sticking out in any way. As soon as you get tall and wide, there is a little bit more, why is this here, that might happen. It may not happen at all. I've parked in parking lots that were just shopping center parking lots where there was a shuttle bus and there was a big box truck like me and there were a couple other large vehicles, but we were definitely the outliers to all the same height, smaller vehicles around us. And so when I had the minivan, I never worried about fitting in. I parked anywhere. When I had the Chevy van, it was a little bit more iffy, but because it was a low roof van, again, people didn't look too hard. It's fine. People have those vans. For all they knew, it was a passenger van with several seats in it. Like, people didn't know for sure what it was. People with the box truck, like I say, still don't know for sure what it was, but it definitely stands out when I'm in a parking lot of nothing but standard vehicles and I'm this giant box truck. Also, now with my stage management career, things have actually gotten more complicated once I accept work. When I went to OSF, when I went to Oregon Shakespeare Festival in 2020, which was the first time they offered me work, and unfortunately the work was cut off by the pandemic, I had a minivan. I simply said I had a car, they gave me a parking pass, and I parked in one of their small lots effortlessly, just like everybody else's car, and I moved into the employee housing apartment. When I was offered work in 2022, this recent contract that just ended, I had to explain what I had and why. I had to do way more explaining because I was hoping to find some place where maybe I could park the rig on campus. Well, all of their parking for like their employees is just for standard cars. So they really did not have a great place for me to bring the box truck and park it. And so it took a little bit more hoops for me to figure out, what was going to work for both sides. And they easily could have said, never mind. Trying to find parking for this giant vehicle is too much. They're cool and they didn't do that. But there was another job I was offered for a winter show, and one of the reasons they couldn't accommodate me was I said I have a large truck down here and I need to be able to park it if I take this job. They had housing for me. They did not have parking for my rig. And so they went with another person, simply because my rig wasn't big enough to easily fit in my rig wasn't small enough to easily fit in a standard parking space. And so there have been complications in having a vehicle that most normal, regular, standard people do not have, especially when I'm still trying to work city standard work where they're not used to anybody showing up with anything bigger than a standard car. So pursuing size, pursuing standing height, pursuing having the biggest thing you can have on wheels as a house on wheels can actually be a huge negative in city van dwelling, depending on what your work and parking situations are. And also, when I visit friends, I sometimes run into the same problem, if I visit them at all. Because if somebody invites me to somewhere that I've never been before, and I have to drive there, my question is immediately, what is the parking like? And then they'll say, oh, well, there's parking. And then I describe what I have. Because I do not want to end up on some tiny, narrow street where I find I can't park and it will be difficult to impossible to turn around. And unfortunately, I do have friends that live in places where it's like, I don't know that I want to go trap myself there, or run the risk of not being able to maneuver the way I need to, or feeling scared to maneuver because the street is narrow or parking is crazy or anything like that. So sometimes it does reduce my ability to interact with other people. It sometimes makes me say no to going places because I'm afraid I won't fit. So there are ways the size handicaps me. And in a city van life situation, it is not ideal to have two vehicles. There are people I'm sure who have done it, who have pulled it off. Makes me a little bit nervous. Like, I've seen people with the RV parked, somewhere where for some weird reason it isn't getting bothered, and they also have a car, and they'll use the car to like drive around the city. So these are not RVers that have like the towing setup and are towing and doing all that. These are people who live in the city, have found some place where they're getting away with sitting in RV for a long while, and they also have a car. I personally would not risk that. In the city, I feel better having everything being all in one. And I would definitely not risk having an RV with no towing setup and a car. To me, that is just far too risky unless I have a paid spot where I know everything is going to be okay. That being said, having the box truck as my only option to drive, it also means I need to always be sure when I get to a place that I'm invited that I am going to be able to park and fit. And sometimes that can be a problem. Power for full-time city dwellers also comes with different concerns than for people who are going out camping. There are some things that are more accomplishable when you're going to go to a campsite and camp for multiple days that are a little bit harder when you have to move around the way you do when you're city van dwelling. Now, just because you're more static as a van dweller doesn't necessarily mean that you're in the city and all of this applies to you, but as a general thing, most people who are static and trying to keep like a regular employment are probably doing some sort of city floating van life where they're not set up at a permanent, semi-permanent campsite for long stretches of time. And that's going to make your power situation very different and your options not the same as someone who knows that they're just going to go to a campsite and be there for multiple days or a long stretch. Now, the biggest difference between a semi-static, static city van dweller who's doing the city float thing and somebody who's doing a campsite is usually going to be your options to charge your power. Now, that does not matter if you have a power station or you have built a DIY solar system. There's usually 3 ways that you are going to charge that thing. You're either going to charge it from solar, which is why we call them solar systems, which is a misdirect because actually they're just house battery systems and solar is not the only option to charge them. And that's how you have to think about your power: input and output. Input is power coming in, output is power going out. And you have to understand how these two work together to be able to get the most efficient system for yourself. If you're doing big power pulls, like you're trying to run that crock pot or air conditioner or whatever, but you don't have any sort of system for bringing back in the power you're taking out, you're putting yourself at a disadvantage. So all this to say, solar is a very popular option. As people say, it's quote unquote free electricity, but that doesn't mean it's efficient electricity. And especially when you're living in a moving vehicle around a city or semi-city like town area, your best bet for solar is usually an attached panel. And I say this, that even though flat panel mounting isn't it is literally not the most efficient way to do solar, but flat panel mounting means you're getting sun all day. So rather you're getting 20% of that panel or 75% of that panel, you're getting some sort of charge all day trickling down to your battery system. And for people who have to up and go a lot and have no situation where they can sit still and just soak up sun, this is a very efficient way to make sure if you are going to do solar that you're always getting something. Now, you can get non-attached panels, park for a while, and lay them out, but you're always going to be limited to the moment of putting them out and putting them away. And those may not be based around the most efficient sun of the day. This doesn't mean you can't use that method. If you can't attach panels, if you don't have the money, if the only panels you have access to are the kind of panels you have to find time to put out and put away, then you're going to be limited to that. And the good thing about having the attached roof panels is you're not limited to the moments that you can get them out for a couple hours a day. Because in most cases, in like 80 to 90% of cases, for most people living this style of van life, you're not going to have all day to sit around and get as much sun as you can. And so once you're limited to non-attached panels, that is going to have a big effect on you if you are relying only on solar. Now, this does not mean that you have to have attached panels. It doesn't mean that that's your only option, because again, we're talking about house battery systems, not solar systems, as much as that term is thrown around, because there are other ways to charge a battery. Now, the other one a lot of people bring up is charging from the alternator. Now, if you have a power station, if you haven't built a DIY system, usually the only way you can charge quote unquote off your alternator is by using an included 12-volt power cord. Now, the thing about those 12-volt power cords that are included with most power stations is they are a very low, inefficient charge. And no, you do not want to push the cigarette lighter in your car, because it is not meant to run heavy inverters or heavy power straight out of that little cigarette lighter attachment. It's for small draw 12-volt items, and you're trying to charge a power station off of it. So even if you have an included cord to use that kind of power, charging through a cigarette lighter port is probably, in most cases, unless you know how to wire up something special or you have a nice little heavy-duty vehicle going on, and at that point you can probably build a more efficient DIY system, you're not going to get a lot of charge out of that. So it's a good supplemental charge, but for a power station, it's never going to be the most efficient charge, especially if you're only doing short drives or not driving a lot. Which, if you don't have a lot of money, and you're doing this because of limited funding or to save money, is going to have a high effect on what you can and can't do. Now, if you build your own battery system, there are a number of methods for getting what's called a DC to DC charge. There are chargers that you can buy. Like, I have a Renogy DC to DC converter that converts my lead acid battery under my hood to power that my lithium batteries can use. There are also more direct charging methods. You can just run a positive and negative cable and have your own little shut-off switch so that when the car is not running, you're not pulling battery from your house battery. And that is the most basic way to do it. Just run a negative, a positive, and a battery shut-off switch. That's the most basic way to do it. There's these things called VSRs, which are voltage-sensitive relays. So when your battery gets up to a certain point, it'll kick itself on and it'll start charging your house battery. So while people use the term charging off your alternator universally, it basically means that you're borrowing power that your alternator is using to charge your engine battery. Now, depending on how much power you're trying to get out of that, you can stress out an alternator. You can actually harm your battery if you don't know what you're doing. So depending on your level of comfort, your level of experience, you might want to go to a mechanic. Even if you feel comfortable with everything having to do with your DIY solar system that doesn't involve that DC to DC connection. For that DC to DC connection specifically, you may want to consult somebody who you trust knows what they're doing, because you can do damage to your primary function of your vehicle, which is that it drives, if the wrong person does that setup. I took a VSR out of my Chevy van because at first it seemed to be operating fine, but then it started affecting the van itself, and I ended up having to replace my battery. I'm more confident with the setup that I have now, but it is an option, and it's definitely something I've seen people do where they just have no solar and just do a DC to DC charge, so that when they turn their engine on, it's also charging their house battery, and they have an electrical system, a house electrical system for their house on wheels just through DC to DC charging. And they drive enough that it's enough charge that it's fine for them. Or they are pairing that charge with what's called a shore power charge. Now, the term shore power is also a universal term because shore power just means you have some sort of plug system, some sort of standard 110, 120, there's other voltage, but it's basically a plug that looks like your house plug where you can plug your house into an outlet. Or you can plug your power station into an outlet. And again, power stations are just going to come with a wall house plug. And the good thing about a power station is you can go to the library, you can pick it up, you can take your shore power charge, which is just that house plug. You can go in the library, you can go into Starbucks, you can go somewhere where you can sit for a couple hours, and you can get a much better charge than you'll probably get out of the 12-volt cord that was included with your power station. If you can actually set up a shore power charge to your vehicle, which has varying levels of complexity, I have the most simple version in my box truck where you give me an extension cord and I can plug my whole box truck in. That's also an option. Maybe. Because your access to this may be limited. If you have friends, it might work out great. When I was running off a Jackery, there were times I would just take my Jackery to my friend's house and I would drop it off. But when that was my primary power, the whole time it was dropped off at her house, I didn't have it to use it. So that's the time I'm going without that power station. Now, I had a smaller power station, but there were things it couldn't do while I was waiting for that larger power station to charge. And most people don't know this, but you can actually turn your refrigerator off for a couple hours. And if it's really, really cold, if it's been keeping its perfect temperature, if it loses a few degrees for a little bit while you charge up your power, you're probably going to be fine. So you can not keep on a fridge 24/7 and still keep your food safely cold. I would say get a thermometer and throw it in your fridge if you're going to try this. But I have been known to cycle my fridge and freezer on and off when I was challenged for power because overnight it cools down. So if I turn my fridge, even my freezer off for a couple hours and then turn it back on in the morning, most of the time my food was fine. I had ice in the freezer that did not melt overnight. And I also keep a couple of cold packs in there, so there's things in there that just keep the cold in. So if you do that, you can cycle a fridge on and off sometimes to conserve on power. But if you're doing the power station thing where you're dropping it off at somebody's house or taking it out of your rig, that means anything that needs power 24/7, like a fridge, would also have to go without power if that is your only power source. Now, this is also true if you're doing van life or camping, but again, they have different situations. So I'm approaching this also from if you're draining your power for something and you need to fill it up, you're not going to be able to just sit at a campsite all day and rely on sitting out panels for the most power that you can pull at the perfect angle. So if you're anyway limited in restacking your power as it drains during the day, you have different and more limited options when you're living full-time city van life, especially because the chances of you having shore power, unless you have a friend's house or you're somehow borrowing from a space that's letting you borrow from it, it's going to be very hard for you to rely on shore power even if your vehicle is capable of it. Now, the thing is, you can also use a shore power input with a generator, and I do own a generator. The complication to using a generator is also where you're going to put the generator. You just can't park anywhere you want in the city, pull out a generator, and plug into it. So even if you own a gas-powered generator, you need a logical way or a logical space to use that in the city. Have I pulled it off? Yes. Sometimes in situations where I was shocked I got away with it. But it's definitely not an easy thing. So again, there are just limitations to every option you have when you're doing city van life in a vehicle. If you're relying on roof solar is more inefficient than being able to tilt your solar panels and being able to put them in the most prime spot. But they're always attached. As soon as the sun comes up, they're pulling some kind of power. You can have separated panels, but you're only going to be limited to hours where you can get them out. And you may be limited to situations where you can't tilt the panels for the best conditions. If you are doing alternator power, again, if you're doing it directly from some sort of DC to DC charger, or you've set up a proper VSR or a just really simple battery shutoff charge, those are really efficient, but they're limited to how much you actually drive. So if you're not driving a lot, an alternator charge, as people like to call it, isn't going to do you much, especially if you have a power station and you're just relying on one of those 12-volt cords that come out of the box. None of those have a high power charge. And then even if you have the ability to charge from shore power and you own a generator, which you can use as a substitute for an outlet if you can't find one or you don't have access to one, again, where are you going to find the outlet to charge from? Now, there's a lot of new power stations coming out that have fast charging, meaning you could spend 2 hours in the library and charge up like a 1500 watt power station. And if you have access to that in a guaranteed way, that's great. But if you have that 1500 watt power station, at some point, it is going to run out of power. And if you don't know how you're going to refill that power once it's gone, it may take longer to fill it up than you have time to deal with to get to that full position again. It's a lot with power. It could be its own video, so I don't want to dwell on it anymore, but I just want people thinking about sort of the options to actually refill their power. Because if you have a giant battery bank that you completely deplete before you can really reasonably start to fill it back up again, that is going to be a problem as you're living your van life. I also think it's very important to be realistic about how much power you actually need. When I was in my minivan and my car before it, one of the main things I did was keep my cell phone charged. I even started my channel editing video on my cell phone. Like, my cell phone was my primary computer unless I could go sit down somewhere or go into a building. I didn't try to push it and make my laptop do more than I needed it to do, unless I was absolutely pushed into a situation where I had to use the laptop or a tablet, because I also had a little cheap tablet. I didn't use those because, number one, I needed a hotspot from my phone. Using my phone on my phone was unlimited. My hotspot that I could use from my computer was limited. My hotspot that I could, take off the phone to use from my tablet was limited. But as long as I was using everything on the phone directly, it wasn't, and it was very easy to charge and recharge my cell phone without needing a lot of power. When I first started out, I didn't have a fridge. My first attempt at building my first solar system came because I wanted a fridge. Like, I literally got my first solar system because I wanted a fridge. Because I knew if I got that fridge, I at the time did not have enough power to support that fridge being on. So I knew power had to come before the fridge or with the fridge. And so I saved up to make that happen while I was living in the minivan. Most of my time in the minivan, I actually didn't have a fridge. It was really towards the tail end of my time in the minivan that I got the fridge. And I got it because I figured out how to afford at least a starter solar system. So if you are limited in funds, like if you're doing city van life with, I had enough money to live in an apartment, but I want to start saving that money for other goals, then it may not be a big deal. You can afford the solar system. You can afford the fridge. You can afford like a very comfortable van life. You are just choosing to do it for savings. If you are compromised, however, sometimes you have to accept what you cannot have yet. And that little bit of discomfort and being able to save your way there and build up to it. So being very realistic about the power you need to take care of yourself, to start the journey, to just put yourself in the most comfortable position possible with what you have right now. You should be realistic about that. Maybe for a while you get by on a 300 watt power station because you're going to do no fridge and you're going to rely mostly on your cell phone for entertainment and stuff, and you're going to a job every day. You don't need a powerful computer that you have to run. You're not trying to edit video. You're not trying to run a PS5 in the back of your minivan. If you accept that you're not doing these things, you may not need as much power as you think. It's only when you're trying to run a crock pot and an air conditioner and all of these things that it may become more complicated for you to have the amount of power that you need. And if you just compromise on those things and find ways or can survive without it, then your power needs are reduced. Your cost to have power is reduced. Your depletion of power very quickly that can't keep up with your input of power is reduced. There's so many things that are reduced if you would just accept the fact you can't have the big powerful system yet. It's not going to benefit you. It's going to hurt you more trying to have that right at the beginning than it will benefit you to chase it right at the beginning. Speaking of only using your cell phone, I would say one of the big benefits to city van dwelling is pretty much everything works. Like, a lot of times when people are in rural areas or they're out in the middle of nowhere, they're trying to find a way to have the best internet connection. And before, like, Starlink really started populating, now a lot of people have Starlink. I'm shocked at how many people have Starlink. But before Starlink really started populating as a very popular satellite internet option, and mind you, satellite internet existed before Starlink. It just wasn't very easily available. Starlink became very accessible for more people than satellite internet had been before. But satellite internet also isn't perfect. You need a clear sky. You can't be in a lot of tree coverage. There are very specific parameters you have to meet in order to use satellite internet. But if you can meet those conditions, it's more likely to get a signal in a rural area than some of the other providers, especially those that rely on a cell phone signal, which is what most people in van life are using. So they're either using actual hotspot devices or MiFi devices, they're all the same thing, or they're hotspotting from their phone. So they're using their phone's cell signal to create internet for other devices. And they're also trying to make sure they carry a cell phone that is going to have more coverage across the United States than another cell phone provider. For a long time, people preached to the death about Verizon. Like, Verizon was the choice for anybody who was doing, like, van life. But the smart people knew if you could have more than one provider, on the off chance your primary fails, you have a backup. And I've more lived under that system than any other system. That being said, you can be in the middle of nowhere and none of these providers are working because for the most part, time of recording, they rely on cell phone towers. And if they cannot find that cell phone tower, you will not have a signal. But if you're doing city van dwelling, if you're in a town, probably, good chance, every single provider works, including the cheap ones. And I have always had the knockoff providers who are using the towers of the primary providers, and even now I do. But when I'm in a city, it's very rare that any of these signals go out. And way in the beginning, when I was just living in one city and I could just pick the cheapest phone I could get, it was very easy to use that. And since I wasn't traveling a lot to weird areas where it would stop working or my signal was questionable, again, my phone always worked. It gave me internet, it gave me entertainment, and it was a phone. I could access my email. There's so much I could do from just that phone. And because I was in a city area all of the time, most of the time, even as my van life went on and I did start to do some tripping and traveling around, I could rely on my cell phone most of the time because I wasn't trying to go to these wild rural areas out in the middle of nowhere. So the positive to city van life was actually internet access was pretty darn easy. Another benefit to like city van life and mostly being static is actually the mailbox and the storage situation. Now the thing is, you can get a storage unit and travel, and you try to decide how much you're going to carry with you. Now this is why I don't leave anything behind in a storage unit, because I swear if I leave it behind, I'm going to be 200 miles away and realize I need it. But if you're living in a city van life situation, it's much easier to have a storage unit and use it effectively as sort of backup space. So if you're stuck in, when I had a car, I had a storage unit. And if you're and when I was building out the box truck, I had a storage unit just so I didn't have to have everything in the box truck with me while I was trying to do the build out while I was living in it. And I stayed in one area until that build was done. I wasn't traveling around building as I go. I was building as I go, living in it, and staying very near my storage unit so that when I was ready to do the next project, I could just circle back to that storage unit. Having that storage unit and living in one city is easy because I always know that I'm within easy driving distance of that storage unit. That was a positive. Same thing with my mailbox. Yes, you can get a mailbox, you can get a UPS box, you can get other private mailbox systems where you can call and get your mail shipped to you. But the thing is, you need an address for the mail to go to, and sometimes I'm between locations in a way where I don't know where I'm going to land. Like if I'm doing some traveling, I may not know exactly where I'm going to land to even get mail forwarded, and I may get somewhere unfamiliar where I now have to figure out where the post office is, if I can send mail there, etc., etc. So it's much more complicated. If I'm just living in the same city where my mailbox is, I just go to my mailbox whenever I want to and check it out. But when I'm very far away from my mailbox, yes, I can get it shipped to me. I'm also going to be paying for postage on it again, because postage was paid by the sender to send it to my mailbox. If I'm in the same city, it costs me no money. I go to my mailbox, I pick it up, I go on with my life. If I leave town and I'm getting that mail forwarded to me, I'm now incurring a cost that I don't have when I'm just staying in the same city with my mailbox. So once you start traveling and having a mailbox, you have this choice. You can just let the mail sit there until you can get to it, or you can get it forwarded to you. If I want to order something and I'm in town where my mailbox is, I know I can get a package shipped to me and I can get it as soon as it arrives. If I'm out of town, it's like, am I going to send my package to an alternative address, whatever that alternative address is, or am I going to send it to my mailbox and then get it reshipped to me when I get to an alternative mailbox that I can have things shipped to, or address, or when I'm near a friend's house? You know, it gets much more complicated once you leave town. Now, both people who are doing traveling in van life and people who are static with van life can use the private mailbox and can use storage to alleviate some of the stuff they need to carry in their rig. But it's going to be more complicated and more costly. If you need to reship that box that you sent to your mailbox in Tennessee while you're in California, you now have to pay postage for that box to get reshipped. Even if you're getting an envelope of mail, it's going to cost a little bit less, but you have to pay postage to get that mail reshipped. So postage is being paid on it twice to get it to you, which might be fine if your priority is travel and you know you've guaranteed that most of your important things are coming to you digitally. But there may be gaps where this doesn't work out. I try to get as much sent to me digitally as possible, but there are things that are still going to come through the paper mail that you have to deal with. Or you may not get to something right away because a letter was sent and you were away from home for 3 months and you decided to let the mail sit. And then when you get back into town and you check your mailbox, there's something that you were supposed to take care of that arrived 3 months ago. Now, there's a lot of ways around this if you can travel. But it's much easier if you're just on static van life and you can just check your mailbox whenever you want just by driving over there. It's much easier to get something out of your storage unit when it's only going to take you 20 minutes to get there as opposed to being across the country. I literally know people who have left stuff in a storage unit and they were traveling, and the easiest thing for them to do was rebuy something they already owned because it was in a storage unit halfway across the country. And so this is just something to consider. It's not saying one thing is bad or good. It's just saying as a static city van dweller, these things are actually some of the positives, especially when we talk about a lot of the negatives. I would say also another advantage to doing some sort of city or static style van life is gas costs. Now, because my box truck only gets like 10 miles to the gallon, I'm asked a lot about like what it costs me every month to, drive this thing and use gas. And my gas costs when I'm traveling, like this past month when I drove down to Texas, is going to be way higher than my normal gas costs. Because if I need to, I will vary that cost. When I'm just running errands and staying static in one area, especially for a job, maybe I'm using the box truck to run a few errands. Maybe I have to move it a little bit. but I'm not moving it a lot. And the advantage of being in an area is you know your parking spots. You know where you can and can't go. You're not driving around forever looking for some place to dock. At least not if you've been doing it for a while. Like, at first, you may need to figure out, like, where you can go, where you can't go, where you can be, where you can't be. Like, you have to figure out your own parameters based on your own area. Because the advice I could give you from being in the Bay Area would be completely irrelevant to you if you're living in DC or Baltimore, Maryland, or New York, or Oklahoma, or Tennessee. Yeah, I can give you vague pointers, but I can't say go here. I would say the worst advice ever is park at Walmart. Because that's why more and more Walmarts are not allowing it. Now, there are plenty of Walmarts that do. I've certainly stayed at Walmarts, but I judge each Walmart on its own. I don't assume because it's a Walmart, I'm going to be allowed to park there overnight. Like, if I'm traveling and I'm in an unfamiliar area, Walmart may be a place I look at, but it's certainly not the last, and I'm certainly not depending on it. But when I'm familiar with the area, I know where I can get away with it. I know which shopping centers will ignore me overnight. I know if I can slip into like a public transportation, maybe park and ride type spot and use it. I know it because I live there. I live there all the time. I know how often or not other people are bothered doing it, or how often or not I've been bothered doing it, or I have a good assessment of the area and how it responds to things. And every area isn't the same. And this is something you have to work out on your own. I don't rely 100% on seeing other people get away with it. In fact, if I see too many people getting away with it, I start thinking there is a point where all of these people getting away with it are going to stop getting away with it because there's too many of them. So I try to float to a spot where I think, hey, I can definitely park here. It's completely legal, and not that many other people are doing what I'm doing. And so nobody's looking for it. And it becomes a skill to sort of figure it out. And like I said, on a personal basis, I can give you pointers, but I can't say, go to Target. Definitely don't go to Target. I mean, I'm not saying I've never gotten away with parking at a Target. I certainly have. But I would never universally say go to Target because I've slept at a Target a couple of times. You know, just to give an example. I've gotten away with several Home Depots, but that's because I'm in a box truck. So I know if people are just glancing casually at night, it's not weird to see a box truck in the back of a Home Depot parking lot. But there may be that one Home Depot where like somebody has tried it one too many times and you will get in trouble. So unless you assess the area and know it, it's not a universal law I'm going to send out not only to everybody in van life, but everybody with a box truck. Because they may run across situations where it's not true that you're going to get away with it. But if we're talking on a personal basis, I can tell you what to look for. I can give you a general idea. I can say, look around your town and have 4 or 5 spots that you know you can easily get to that's not going to be inconvenient to you that you can use. People bring up industrial areas all the time. But I'm like, if it's going to take me an hour to get to an industrial area and I know a street parking spot I can park to in like 10 minutes, I'm going to go to the 10-minute street parking spot. I'm not going to take myself way out to an industrial area that's more of a pain to get to, even if I know, like, it's a place I can park. It's more out of my way. And so, like, with city van life especially basing things around where my job is, I'm going to make it as convenient to me as possible since my house moves and I can control my commute to a point. When I didn't have pets, I'm less comfortable with this now that I have them, but when I didn't have pets, sometimes what I would do is park, you know, especially if I was going into San Francisco, is I would park at a public transportation spot, get on the train, go into San Francisco, come out of San Francisco, get back into my vehicle, boom. My vehicle was secure all day. It was in a safe spot all day. While I was doing work, or maybe not doing work, maybe I went to San Francisco to meet a friend, you know, and we took in some sights and then we came back. There's a lot of things that you can make work for you in a city environment, but it's a little bit trial and error that make it work. However, if you're staying in one area, you get very used to what it is very quickly as you're living your van life in that area. And some people, they do a mix of travel and a home area. They may not own a house or a, traditional home base in that area, but they know that area. So rest for them isn't necessarily returning to a house they own or land they own, but they go to a city they know because they know it's going to be really, really easy to live there for a few months without the stress of travel. And then when they're ready to travel, they leave that area and they go do some exploring. And when they need to wind down, it's not so much, again, that they're going to a specific house or home base. They're just going to an area they know where it's easier to live a little bit more relaxed in their vehicle. Now, I'll say the big exception to this, and some of these things I've talked about, is if you live in a more rural area where you have access to BLM land or access to places that you can park very easily and legally without having to worry about street side parking and that sort of stuff. But that's not everybody's truth. I would also say there's snowbirds who fall into sort of this middle space. Yes, they're quote unquote traveling, but they go to a specific area for the winter. And they might do a little bit of shuffling around, but they're not doing a lot, so that they're saving on those gas costs, so that they're using those familiar areas, so they're not going a bunch of new places where they're not sure how much cost is going to be involved to get there and get out of there. And then in the summer, they go to a specific area. They stay within a few miles of that area, shifting themselves around a little bit, but not a lot, saving money, not going all across the U.S. all of the time. And maybe when they have money, if they have money, they do a little more exploring than they normally do. So they're also like this rural middle line where they're not city static van dwellers, but they're also not shooting across the country all the time. And they don't have a traditional home base. But they know their rural area. They know where they have access to BLM land. They know how to float without spending too much money in the summer in the same area. And they know how to float without spending too much money in the winter in the same area. Whew. So that was a lot of information. I really wanted to cover sort of this idea because I think people try to apply universal laws to van life, i.e. because you have a low gas mileage vehicle, you must be spending more money than the person with the high gas mileage vehicle. But that person with the high gas mileage vehicle got that to have the most efficient savings to travel a lot. So they may be spending more money on gas in their high mileage vehicle than I'm spending in my low mileage vehicle, but that's because they're moving around more than me. So if they did have my vehicle, they would spend more. But even with their vehicle, they're spending more, just not as much as they would. Whereas I have a vehicle that can settle and keep me comfortable on purpose. My purpose is to be comfortable when I'm settled, when I have to be places for a long stretch. That's why I have, a Nintendo Switch, because I know I might spend a lot of boring nights in very not interesting places. So me being able to play video games in my box truck is kind of a fun activity to have when I'm sitting still, just like I used to play games on my phone. Having subscription services like Netflix is kind of important because, there's not always something pretty outside my video, and I can't financially always be in pursuit of that. But I can be comfortable. I can be happy. I can enjoy my house because that is the purpose of my house. The purpose of my house on wheels is to be a house. The on wheels part is a convenience that I can use for a number of things. Shortening my commute, for example. Being able to take my home with me even if I'm offered a job out of state, which means I can actually travel slower, easier, because when I stop, I can stop anywhere. Even places that aren't the most pretty travel places, I can stop at a rest area. I can stop at a truck stop. And I can make my dinner and just close in for the night. And I'm still in my comfortable house and I can keep traveling the next day until I get to the spot where my next job is. And sometimes I can travel for fun. Because I have the money and I patiently waited in those unfun, long city static stretches to save that money, to be able to travel, to be able to enjoy things, and to be able to experience that other side of van life. But I don't have to experience it all the time. I don't have to make myself go broke. Just because my vehicle can drive doesn't mean I need to push it to the limit of its driving all of the time. It means I can take advantage of the fact that it can drive when it benefits me and how it benefits me. Alright, that's all I got for this one. If you have anything to say and you're watching this on YouTube, feel free to leave something in the comments. If you're listening to this on Spotify, or hopefully by now I've been able to get it on some other platforms, feel free to reach out to me. Let me know what you think. Again, you can find me on YouTube as Dawn of Vanlife, as well as under the Housing Anarchy podcast on YouTube if you're interested in the visual version. Alright, I'll see you next week.